Hello, English 46A students. I want to talk to you about Milton's Paradise Lost. And one of the things I'm really happy about is that in the 10th edition, first, Paradise Lost is optional. I'm not going to quiz you on it. In my experience, I really need to be there in person. It's a little bit like the Iliad, Homer's Iliad in that regard, or the Odyssey, where with Epic, it really helps to be in the room, to read aloud together, to talk about it, to be able to handle questions back and forth in that regard. So besides just missing the in-person teaching experience because of this remote education option here during the pandemic, I'm sorry we're not going to do Milton. Milton's Paradise Lost is a powerful epic. It's, written in the, comes out, 1663, 1674? A little later than most of our other works, but Milton is solidly a Renaissance writer. I recommend that you read the biographical material in the Norton. I recommend that you read the introductory material for Paradise Lost, even if you don't go on to read the poem yourself. You might be intrigued when you read the intro to Paradise Lost to read further. It's a hard poem. Other works have, like, in terms of blank verse, Milton ends up between Shakespeare and Milton. They become the key guides to blank verse, which is unrhymed iambic pentameter, the sort of thing that you get in a Shakespeare drama, a tragedy, the soliloquies that you may know from Hamlet or Macbeth or whatever it have you. The parts that don't rhyme, that's blank verse. Milton's Paradise Lost is also written in a non-rhyming form. And these two, the works of Shakespeare in particular, and the works of Milton in Paradise Lost in particular, become models for later poets. The great romantic poet John Keats, who died too young of tuberculosis, he kept trying to, imitate Milton, and not in a slavish way, not in a plagiaristic way, but Milton was offering this model. Other romantic poets, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley, the writer of Frankenstein, her husband, they all felt the Miltonic model and the grand idea of, like, Milton wanted to do an epic for the English. The Greeks have their epics, the Romans have theirs, etc., etc. Related to that, other works since then, for example, I mentioned Frankenstein, sort of the invention of science fiction. Mary Shelley, she starts writing in 1816, gets published in 1818, so that's what we call the English Romantic period. But the creature that the scientist Victor Frankenstein makes, for one thing, reads Milton's Paradise Lost. He finds it in a suitcase, and I won't go into it now how he learns to read, but it's one of the 4 books that informs who he is. And so when Mary Shelley, in this novel, which reaches out and speaks to so many people, she looked for what's a primary text, what's a text that her readers would know. So those of you who are just interested in literature, those of you who think of yourselves, whether formally or not, as English majors, Milton's Paradise Lost is worth some trouble to acquire. And I do think it takes a little bit of trouble. Some of it's grand and wonderful, awe-inspiring. Some of it's a bit of a slog. You need an edition, as we have, with good footnotes, I think. But it also helps to read it in a group. Okay, so I'm sorry that's just time-wise. It just doesn't stay. and it just didn't seem a fair demand on you. Okay. Besides Frankenstein, I mean, one of the great novels I know, Herman Melville's Moby Dick, published in 1851, is between Shakespeare and Milton and everything else that Herman Melville ever read. It makes it in here. This is also a very funny book when it's not tragic. And it's written in the course of mostly short essays. I mean, there's one 25-page chapter. Otherwise, most of the chapters are 3 to 9, 7 or 8, 9 pages long. It's actually in the form of sort of essays. Anyway, I love this book. It's about work, frankly, and I might have mentioned this in a different video. But knowing Milton, there's a satanic character, Satan. Milton Satan in Paradise Lost is this huge heroic character, and he's very much like the characters from Virgil's Aeneid and Homer's Iliad, in that he begins the poem as an archangel who has gone up against God, because, as you're going to find out, or you may find out, he'd rather rule in hell than serve in heaven. But he's this grand figure who, over the course of the poem Paradise Lost, diminishes. And I did talk about this in another video. He diminishes to the state of being a snake, a frog, these forms. That light that he had carried down from him from heaven becomes darkness in hell. It's darkness visible, which is meant to be a paradox, because light is something that's associated with divinity, and these are fallen angels. But Satan was such a high angel, a great angel, the archangel, one of the archangels, and he falls. But he's this powerful, heroic figure who's frustrated at having to serve. He's frustrated, and he's plotting to go up against God again. And he also, his motivation, he then plots, and he's going to ruin this new species, these humans in paradise. No. God's not going to replace the fallen angels with these creatures. It's very powerful. And frankly, besides borrowing lines from Satan for Ahab to speak, he's the captain who's after the white whale in Moby Dick. If any of you happen to know Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, lots of Satan. More seriously, perhaps, though The Wrath of Khan's a good film. More seriously, this anti-hero, a heroic anti-hero. In the 20th century, the anti-hero is going to become a non-hero. But before that, in the 1700s, let's begin with Satan in the 1600s, mid 1600s, and then in the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, you have what's going to be called the Byronic hero. But he was around, this figure was around before that, who is this dark, brooding, frustrated, proud anti-hero. He's very heroic, but he's a bad guy. If you know your Heathcliff from Wuthering Heights, if you know Mr. Rochester from Jane Eyre, if you've read some Byron, not Frankenstein, excuse me, but Dracula in the novel has some of these brooding, passionate qualities, even though, he's an out-and-out monster, a vampire, a magnetic character. The great poet and mystic William Blake said that Milton was of the devil's party, though he didn't know it. That is, Milton, according to Blake, poured so much genuine sort of revolutionary zeal into the figure of Satan that obviously he's just too positive. In a certain way, because Satan is the old sort of heroic, it's you could imagine why this character would actually have appeal. You could imagine why a character like Satan, in this case, would especially heroically presented, But he's diminishing. He's diminishing. Um, would appeal because Adam and Eve are they're not fighting wars. They're not going up against God. They're just trying to get along. They're not. Satan is the action figure, but he's doomed. He's doomed, and we know that because Milton was writing for a Christian culture that knew Satan is the adversary. Satan is the wrong path. But one thing I found interesting when I read this myself, as an undergrad, I took a senior seminar on Milton, which meant I had the time to actually spend my time. I was introduced to Paradise Lost, not all of it, but a good chunk of it, in a class just like our 46A. And then I ended up, doing the senior seminar because I wanted to know more Milton and I needed help. And so that's why I took the class. Okay. So what Milton does, and he does this very deliberately, very argumentatively in the highest sense. He wants to put classical models, how the epic is written in Homer and Virgil, in English. And he thought about doing a King Arthur story, but he decided, let's go to the most important story for his Christian culture. And England had had a Protestant rebellion, and actually the King of England had his head chopped off, and a Puritan, what's called the Puritan interregnum between kings, was in power, and Milton was a very important figure as an assistant to the highest lords, that sort of thing. Milton decided to take the most important story, as he felt, for English people, which is the biblical story. Later in life, he wrote a play called Paradise Regained, which is about Christ and being tempted in the desert by Satan. So he's more deliberately with Christ. Christ is in Paradise Lost, but not yet on the cross, because most of the action of Paradise Lost takes place in what we might call prehistory. That is, the beginning of the earth, beyond that, before earth even exists. We have the rebellion of Satan and the other angels against God and the good angels. That's set up, and we get a description of Satan's fall through space into hell, a place called Pandemonium, which is wonderfully described. And then we get, this new species, paradise on Earth, which hangs in the universe like a jewel. It's quite lovely. We see Earth as Satan is flying. He's got these giant like bat wings as he's flying across chaos in the cosmos to find out who's these new creatures that God's going to replace the angels with. And part of the point of that would be that was the sort of potential until Adam and Eve fall by breaking the one thing they were told not to do, by breaking their oath to obey God. And it's an interesting poem in part because it has to deal with this key problem. Okay, I know I'm sliding a little bit, which is, well, there's problems like knowledge. If God knows everything, why did he set up a situation where it's going to fail? But the idea is humanity, and I'm not proselytizing here, I'm just trying to help you with the poem. The drama here is that Adam and Eve are, quote, sufficient to have stood, though free to fall, unquote. Adam and Eve, as God explains to another character who asks the question, have to have free will. Otherwise, their devotion to God, their worship of God, would mean nothing. They'd be mere automatons. But in creating creatures, Adam and Eve, who could choose the wrong thing, there's a risk. God would like them to choose the right thing, but they have to choose. Okay, so that creates a certain drama, and you have the resentful Satan who is seeking to get revenge. So it's a revenge play, and so we have it play out. Okay, so you have the heroic background, which is giving form to this epic, which is 12 books long. And that's meant to be half of. It's meant to follow Virgil. Virgil did 12 books, and Homer's was 24. So Virgil, the Roman poet, in his Aeneid was bowing before the master Homer. Milton, when he first published it, he had it divided into 10 books so that he was paying his homage to the great Virgil. If any of you know Dante's Divine Comedy in the Inferno, the first book of hell, Virgil is Dante's guide. Okay, so Virgil really matters, despite being from, just past Julius Caesar's time, a very important Renaissance figure. At least, actually, was considered a wizard, and also considered Christian before Christianity in a certain sense. But that's off topic. All right. So we have all this epic machinery. Okay. We have heroes. We have descriptions of armor and weapons. We have descriptions of places and people. We have speeches in order to drive us forward. You will recognize this from Beowulf. Beowulf is often called the Old English epic. I tend not to. I think it comes from an entirely different tradition. The monk may have read Virgil's Aeneid previous to writing down Beowulf, but Beowulf's Germanic in nature. But across cultures, beyond the classical Greek and Roman, into the Germanic, across the way, they're not borrowing, it's just cultures end up doing the same things. Like houses, they're either square or round, generally. Culture after culture after culture. In this case, speeches. So my plan, or my experience, is that the work you had done with Beowulf, understanding speeches, intricate back and forth, flashback, flash forward, elusive remark, this character speaking, that character speaking, all of that was going to pay off reading Paradise Lost. Now, I have to admit, sometimes it gets hard to keep track of who says what, even though Milton will say, thus spoke Ariel, thus spoke Adam, thus spoke God, the omnipotent one. Okay, also the heroic wise, there's lots of references like, breaker of the shield wall, those sort of epithets, right? Kennings in Milton also. Milton may have actually known Old English because he basically read everything before he went blind. He read everything possible in England and various libraries and estates on the continent. He just was that kind of guy. All right. He was teased for his long hair when he went to college. He was not a guy who took teasing very easily. Maybe that went into the satanic character as well. A little bit of brooding resentment. I don't know. All right. Okay. So Milton takes the heroic models and heroic culture. He takes the biblical story, and the Bible's full of heroism, especially, the Old Testament is full of heroism. The New Testament is a revision of heroism, and that's something that happens in book 9. The very beginning of book 9 in our book, you'll see there's a speech in which Milton has to say, it's time to revise things. The old heroic model, Achilles, the Greek, is not the right model. What we need is the better fortitude. Oh, let's see, where's my quotation? I should find it. All right. So what I was going to say about the 10th edition while I'm looking for, unlike the 9th, remember I have the 9th, most of my notes are in the 9th edition, and my old 4th edition, my old green one, which is over my shoulder. This edition, the 10th, they put back what are called arguments. Okay. Um, and I'll show you in this other book. It's over here. It's a summary. Each book of the 12 of Paradise Lost starts with an argument, quote unquote, which is a summary of what we're going to get. It's sort of, it's more, it's more essayistic in sense it's argumentative, that is, it's trying to push you in the right direction so you get what's there, than like a bland summary. It was not bland at all in that regard. But in the very opening of book 9, and book 9 and book 10 are crucial. And in fact, I even wrote that way back in 1980, whatever it was. Crucial book. Satan, having compassed the earth with meditated guile, returns as a mist by night into paradise, enters into the serpent sleeping. So there was already a serpent there who was just this innocent creature. Satan slides in. Adam and Eve in the morning go forth to their labors, which Eve proposes to divide in several places, each laboring apart. Adam consents not, alleging the danger lest that enemy of whom they were forewarned should attempt her found alone. Eve, loath to be thought not circumspect or firm enough, urges her going apart, the rather desirous to make trial of her strength. Adam at last yields. The serpent finds her alone. His subtle approach, first gazing, then speaking, with much flattery extolling Eve above all other creatures. Eve, wondering to hear the serpent speak, asks how he attained to human speech and such understanding not till now. The serpent answers that by tasting of a certain tree in the garden he attained both to speech and reason, till then void of both. Eve requires him to bring her to that tree, and finds it to be the tree of knowledge forbidden. The serpent, now grown bolder, with many wiles and arguments, induces her at length to eat. She, pleased with the taste, deliberates a while, whether to impart thereof to Adam or not. At last brings him of the fruit. Relates what persuaded her to eat thereof. Adam at first amazed, but perceiving her lost, resolves through vehemence of love to perish with her. It's a romance. And extenuating the trespass, eats also of the fruit. The effects thereof in them both, they seek to cover their nakedness, then fall to variance and accusation of one another. They fall. Once they've sinned, once they've broken that, bad things happen. Okay. The line I also wanted, so the arguments are really useful to go through. And even if you just wanted to have a sense of what's going on, yes, it's antique, 17th century language. You have to work it a little bit. We have good notes in our Norton. But even if you just read the arguments, you would get the gist of things. Now, I think of book 9, which includes the temptation and the fall, and book 10 as a Renaissance tragedy, because we build up, they have the fall, and then there's consequence. That's book 10. God comes walking in the garden, and yes, physically, God comes walking in the garden, and he knows. Kind of reminds of me and my father, the police officer. He always knew when I was trying to get away with something. God knows. It's like, because of course God knows. But, and he confronts and like, okay. And anyway, then you had the back and forth, and they try to explain, and Adam is kind of lame, saying she did it. Okay, earlier she's like, okay, you failed, God. I'm gonna eat too because I'm with you. And then in the next book, once the authority figure's there, Adam is a little bit of a weasel. I hate that part. Anyway, but in part of Milton's argument is that we need to turn to the Christian form of heroism. Okay, now remember Christ on the cross, right? Dream of the Rood, Anglo-Saxon. They made that so heroic. Christ is climbing up there to save humanity from itself. Well, here we get the story in Paradise Lost of how humanity let it go. Okay. So again, we got to let go of old heroisms, old models, fabled knights and battles feigned. Fiction is bad. The better fortitude of patience and heroic martyrdom unsung. The way in which you suffer stoically, the way in which you would say, that strength of, say, being on the cross in this case, and enduring it because you'll be rewarded. Again, I'm not trying to proselytize. I'm trying to set up this crucial document in English literature. Okay, so I'm just going to say a little bit more. Again, intensification with book 9. Earlier stuff, the creation of Adam, besides, the heroic parts of Satan and his council of fallen angels. They try to decide what to do. There's all these different characters who have different personalities. It's a lot of fun hanging out with the devils, as it were. Adam and Eve, Adam gets created. We're there. And then when Eve is created, well, Adam's asleep. So she wakes up. This is Milton's vision, not mine. When Eve wakes up, she doesn't notice Adam asleep. She wakes up having been made from the rib, in this case, of Adam. She wanders away. She sees a pool. And she looks at her face. She sees this creature in the water and thinks, that's the most beautiful creature I've ever seen. Oh, I love that. Look how beautiful she is. Well, then Adam walks up, and she's looking at her. She doesn't seem to realize exactly it's her own reflection. She looks at it, so attractive. She looks at him, so different. Now, one part of this, she's attracted to sameness, right? Herself. And then Adam has to talk to her and like, no, I'm your pal, blah, blah, blah. Okay. This is fun for all sorts of reasons. The creature in Frankenstein looks in a pool and sees himself and sees his ugliness. This whole mirror thing, this reflection thing, it's often written up, see women, they're so vain, etc., etc., etc. I hate that part. I hate the misogyny of it. I find it interesting, though. Just as I find it interesting that Milton made, in some ways, Eve is a more energetic character. I wouldn't want to call her heroic. She's the one who's willing to dare to eat the fruit. She's lied to by the serpent, of course, right? Because serpent's like, look, I ate. Look at me. I got improved. I'm now speaking, and and like she doesn't know what a lie is. Imagine that. Lies had not been invented. So one of Satan's kennings, the father of lies. Okay, that's also used for Herodotus, the first Greek historian, the father of history, the father of lies. Okay. Oh, there's more. So let me do one more thing as a potential interest. Remember, reading the arguments could give you the summary of it much better than reading Spark Notes, by the way, because you'll be in with the language that you've been working on. Okay. Milton also wrote short poems that are in our Norton that are worth reading. Il Pensiero, L'Allegro, the Melancholy Man, the Happy Man. That's what those two things are. And he's using Italian as deference to his training. Okay. Paradise Lost. You have to get used to it. It's fancy, and part of the reason is Milton is trying to do something that is so good and so high level that it will be accepted as the greatest poem ever written in English. The part of me that sort of thinks Milton is maybe a little boring in terms of his personal life, etc. Then I think of this ambition and the ambition to be great and to have written the greatest poem ever. I'm drawn to that. I'm drawn to Faustus, I'm drawn to various grand characters. Okay. Of man's first disobedience, and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world, and all our woe with loss of Eden, till one greater man restore us and regain that blissful seat, sing, heavenly muse, that on the secret top of Oreb or of Sinai didst inspire that shepherd who first taught the chosen seed in the beginning how the heavens and earth rose out of chaos. Or if Sion's hill delight thee more, or Silo's brook that flowed fast by the oracle of God, I thence invoke thy aid to my adventurous song. So this is very classical. Homer calls on the muse. Virgil calls on the muse. In this case, Milton calls on the muse, but he's not calling on those Greek goddesses. He's calling on a more biblical source. Okay. Let me just do a little bit more. I thence invoke thy aid to my adventurous song, that with no middle flight intends to soar above the Ionian mount, while it pursues things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. And chiefly thou, O Spirit, that dost prefer before all temples the upright heart and pure, instruct me, for thou knowest. Thou from the first was presence, and with mighty wings outspread, dove-like satst brooding on the vast abyss, and madest it pregnant. What in me is dark, illumine, and what is low, raise and support, that to the height of this great argument I may assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men. So here's his argument. He wants to educate us. And he wants to, in the course of writing this poem, clarify things like free will and the fall. Because again, even back then and all the way back, there's that argument of like, why is there suffering in the world? Why is there poverty? Why is there hunger? Why is there pain? And it's kind of complicated to explain it if you have a benevolent deity. Right? I mean, it's kind of tricky. Otherwise, why isn't everything good? But it's tied up into that idea of sufficient to have stood, though free to fall. Our, humanity's, in the way the story works, right? In the way the belief works. It is humanity's free will. The fact that we can choose. The fact that Adam and Eve could choose. It gives value to everything. Otherwise, there'd be no value. But, so there's a risk. And in this case, they fell. And therefore, part of the poem also wants to cover how Christ is going to volunteer to make it better. Kind of like Gawain. It's like, okay, is there anything I can do? Is there anything I can do, Lord, to help these creatures? And, the Divine Father's like, well, actually, son, there is something you can do if you would be willing to do it. Because here's the other part. Again, I'm not trying to proselytize. I'm just trying to help you with the poem. And again, the consistency of Milton's theme. Christ had to choose to save. Otherwise, there'd be no value in it, would be the argument. Okay? And this is Milton meant it to be something that would increase faith, something that would give people who are not heroes, but are living good, upright Christian lives, it would give them sustenance, spiritual sustenance. Okay. It's a powerful poem, and I recommend it highly, but it is work. Okay. Hope you guys are doing well.